Okay. Shall we start? So, welcome to the 15th Sinclair lecture. You've been waiting for this event for a year now, so we thought we increase the anticipation a little bit by starting slightly later. Anyway, my name is Michaela Malberg, and I'm Professor of Corpus Linguistics here at the University of Birmingham. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Sinclair lecture, especially after we had to put the lecture series on hold for a year due to reasons we might just not want to have to think about for the next hour or so. There will be quite a few people with us tonight who've worked and been friends with John Sinclair. But there will also be new generations of corpus linguists who haven't had the opportunity to meet John personally. So here's a picture of him. In 1965, when he was only 31, John was appointed to the Foundation Chair of Modern English Language here at the University of Birmingham. He's probably best known for his work in lexicography, heading up the COBILT project, a collaboration between the University of Birmingham and Collins Publishers. This project is very much associated with the corpus revolution in lexicography, and to this day is relevant to a lot of corpus research. John has shaped corpus linguistics in many ways, so it is only fitting that we remember him each year with a lecture on the cutting edge of the field. It is fantastic that in recent years we have been hosting the Sinclair lecture together with our Corpus Linguistics Summer School, which comes to a close tonight, sadly. We had an exciting 4 days with sessions by our own Center for Corpus Research team and 2 external guests, Lawrence Anthony from Waseda University and Bethany Gray from Iowa State, and obviously our lovely participants from all over the world. Now, a few housekeeping things before we can get going. As every year, the lecture will be recorded. And if you want to live tweet, here is this year's hashtag Sinclair Lecture 2021. Today, we also have 2 sign language interpreters. So we've got Naomi Byrne and Christopher Stone. And I hand over to our head of college, Professor Andrei Gonchorek now, who will introduce this year's speaker, my most wonderful colleague, Dagmar Divjak.
Good evening, everybody. Michaela, thank you so much for that introduction to the Sinclair lecture. And I'm delighted to add a few remarks to Michaela's welcoming to this lecture and to say a few words about Professor Dagmar Divjak, who will be speaking tonight on the intriguing sounding topic of women and machines, an interdisciplinary take on language in use. Born in Belgium, Professor Divjak obtained her BA, MA and PhD degrees at the University of Leuven, one of the leading centers for cognitive linguistics and quantitative corpus methods. Professor Divjak also holds a degree in teaching modern foreign languages. In fact, it's her experience in teaching language that has played a crucial role in getting her into research. After finishing her MA in Slavonic philology, she started teaching Russian to undergraduate students at the University of Leuven, while also pursuing a further MA in computational linguistics. Frustrated by the inadequacy of the grammatical descriptions that she could offer to her students and that she could use to write computer code, she embarked on a PhD in linguistics instead, which was funded by the Research Council FWO Flanders. After postdoctoral stints in the United States, at UNC Chapel Hill, and also in Sweden at Stockholm University, Professor Divjak moved to the UK in 2006 to take up a position as lecturer, and she's worked here ever since. In January 2019, she joined the University of Birmingham as a professorial research fellow, and she was appointed across the departments of linguistics and modern languages, and we're absolutely delighted that she joined our university. At the University of Birmingham, Dagmar leads the Out of Our Minds team, which is an interdisciplinary group of 12 researchers who are working to better understand language and to use the insights they gain to make language learning more rewarding and successful. And this research is funded by a £1 million Research Leadership Award from the Leverhulme Trust. Dagmar has published 9 monographs, handbooks, and edited volumes. She's written over 60 articles and is, among many other things, the current editor-in-chief of Cognitive Linguistics, the leading journal in her field. Due to her outstanding achievements as a researcher, she was elected as an ordinary member of Academia Europaea of the section of Linguistic Studies in 2020. I'm absolutely delighted that she'll be delivering today's Sinclair lecture. And without further ado, I hand back over to Michaela and to Dagmar.
Directly to Dagmar now.
I'll move you all out of your own way, so to speak. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Michaela and Andre, and welcome everyone to this year's Sinclair lecture, which also doubles as my inaugural lecture. And I would never have thought that I'd be giving my inaugural lecture from home in my flip-flops, but here we are. And the silver lining is, of course, that so many more of you were able to join. So in this talk, I will tell you more about the research program I'm pursuing with the Out of Our Minds team. We aim to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. We want to understand language better, we want to understand learning better, and we want to use that new knowledge about language and learning to improve foreign language learning experience and outcomes. But before delving into some case studies, I will first go back in history a bit. All Sinclair lecturers are asked to include an old picture, and this is one of me as a PhD student reading a dictionary. I read many, many dictionaries as a PhD student. I was working on a project that required me to describe usage patterns of a specific subset of verbs, and I was told that if I did this well, I'd end up with groups of verbs that express vaguely similar things, like maybe verbs that express different kinds of emotions, like laugh and cry. But I worked so diligently on my classification that the categories I ended up with contained sets of near synonyms. That's words that mean virtually the same thing, such as cry and weep. And that led me to the next challenge. Could I go further and tease even near synonyms apart in an objective and verifiable way? It turned out to be possible and led to a method we later called behavioral profile analysis. It's been described as the most detailed method for relating lexical meaning and grammatical preferences, an idea that was dear to the heart of John Sinclair. So I'm really honored to be giving this year's Sinclair lecture. The idea that we can get to meaning by tracking usage is also what attracted me to usage-based theories of language. These theories are generally built on the assumption that we build our knowledge of a language from the ground up using general cognitive abilities. That is, cognitive abilities that we also use in other areas of our life. For example, the ability to pick up patterns, to detect similarities, to categorize instances, and so on. This gets us around the need to posit an innate universal grammar or language-specific cognitive principles, something linguists have struggling to find convincing evidence for close to 75 years now. It also ensures that the knowledge we assume language users have remains concrete and faithful to their experience with language. Now, the early 2000s were a really exciting time to be a PhD student and to be asking questions related to usage. At that time, linguistics went through a methodological paradigm shift, which started with eminent usage-based linguists like Dirk Gerards arguing strongly for the need to ground linguistics in actual usage as collected in corpora, which are large electronic text collections. And once we linguists got used to having lots of authentic data, we turned to statistical techniques to help us detect patterns in that sea of data. And I happily toiled away until at some point the doubts started creeping in. I started to wonder, are the patterns that I find in the data real? And there are two possible answers to this question. If you mean by that question, do these patterns that you found with your statistical techniques in your corpus data, do they exist in the data? Then the answer is, of course, yes. But if you mean by that question, do these patterns that you found with statistical techniques in corpus data exist in the minds of speakers? Then the answer is at best, possibly. And so the identity crisis of a cognitive linguist was born. As a cognitive linguist, I often felt torn between the cognitive and the linguistic. I didn't really know whether to choose one or to compromise. It was difficult to decide whether I was going to classify phenomena as economically as possible while accounting for as much of the data as possible and as well as I possibly could, or whether I would work and classify phenomena in a way that's more in line with what we know about cognition. And of course, we can do the data work and then run some experiments to find out whether or not what we found in the corpus data is relevant to language users. And we did that, but it's a bit of a trial and error approach. It's hit and miss. Sometimes you find confirmation for the patterns and other times you don't. So I started suspecting or thinking that it might be better to build this cognitive plausibility in from the start. After all, that the linguistic system emerges from use is a foundational assumption in cognitive linguistics. But despite our interest in the emergence of a system from use, processes or functions that would enable growing a system from use have been absent from usage-based considerations. So I tried to try and bake cognitive plausibility into my analyses, and I ended up doing that via the concept of learning. Now, research into learning has a long and venerable history in psychology, but it is conspicuously absent from research on language. In fact, learning has been said to constitute our very own elephant in the room. Learning was exiled vigorously from the linguistic landscape by Chomsky, who wrote a damning criticism of Skinner's verbal behavior in the 50s of the 20th century. And recent years have seen a resurgence in the interest in learning, but learning is still to make a full comeback onto the linguistic scene. Now, for me personally, it was computational work done by Harald Bayen and Peter Millin that piqued my interest in learning and gradually led me deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole of learning. And integrating insights from learning theory with insights from usage-based linguistics has become the core of the research program I'm pursuing with the Out of Our Minds team, which I lead together with Peter Millin. Our work focuses on a number of things, mainly what learning can tell us about language, that is, about how language works, but also on how data from language can challenge theories of learning. After all, language is arguably the most complex system that human beings learn to use, but most of us do so very successfully. Such an approach, we think, will provide valuable insights into the kinds of generalizations or abstractions that can lay claim to cognitive plausibility, and this may ultimately alter the way in which linguists think about language. But that type of research should also provide better materials for foreign language learning. And I have Laura Janda to thank for showing me how theory and application can enrich each other's existence. Methodologically, our approach is firmly anchored in corpus linguistics. We start from an extensive corpus-based analysis of the phenomenon we're interested in. There is no better way to get to know your phenomenon than by getting your hands dirty in the data. In the next step, we factor learning in by using computational techniques that implement principles of learning to model what could be learned from the data we got our hands dirty in. And our computational work then generates hypotheses that we test first in the lab and then, fingers crossed, transfer to the classroom. Now, for the purpose of this Sinclair lecture, I've selected a few case studies that focus on the data phases of our work, that's to say, the corpus and computational phases. And what I will be presenting today fits with Sinclair's dictum that language looks very different if you look at a lot of it at once. And we'll be looking at a lot of data, but with two disclaimers. I'm not aiming to do things as well as computationally possible. My interest is in doing things as cognitively plausible as possible because I'm a cognitive linguist. Members of the team are cognitive psychologists. So ideally, we want our model to be as exactly as good or exactly as bad as language users are. And we definitely want for it to get exactly the same things right or wrong. Or to say it with Amos Tversky, we're not interested in artificial intelligence, but in natural stupidity. Because that way we can use computational techniques to learn more about human cognition. Another thing we're not trying to do is trying to convert the world to learning, let alone trying to convince anyone that learning will solve all the problems of linguistics. It won't. But we do feel that learning has something very valuable to offer the usage-based community because we do need to show how a linguistic system emerges from exposure to usage and what a cognitively realistic system would look like. So off with the first case study, and that's a study on time in language. That's a very problematic concept. What is time? It's a question that has kept many disciplines busy for centuries. Linguists are particularly interested in how time is expressed in language, and they rely on two concepts to do this. These concepts are tense and aspect. And I've put here on the slide the table of contents of a monograph on the topic that was written by a leading scholar, Robert Binnick. And it illustrates that these concepts have a long history and have a very problematic history. Now, tense is the easier concept of the two. And tense is said to express or to provide us with different ways of locating events in time relative to the time of speaking. It has been debated. It may be the easier concept. It has been debated since antiquity, though. So as you can see in the table of contents, we have ancient theories of tense, traditional theories of tense, modern theories of tense, and we are now ready to go beyond theories of tense. But what is aspect? As you can see in the table of contents too, on the right, the section on aspect starts with the subtitle, The Problem of Aspect. Aspect is indeed a major problem. It's said to refer to the different ways of viewing the internal temporal constituency of a situation. And if that means very little to you, don't worry, linguists don't really mean what it knows either. But we're happy to put our conceptual doubts aside and use these concepts for descriptive purposes. So generally, grammars of English assume the existence of 12 tense aspect combinations. And these arise from the combination of 3 tenses in red on the slide and 4 aspects in green, as you can see in the table as well. Now, on a grammatical approach to tense and aspect, you would start by defining the abstract meaning of each tense and each aspect separately. So as I said, tense is relatively easy. If I talk about something that happened yesterday, I will use a past tense. If I talk about something that will happen tomorrow, I use a future tense. And if I talk about the now, I use the present tense. Aspect's trickier, but we managed to explain it in a similar way. We say that the simple aspect is used to express a fact. The perfect aspect is for actions which are completed, but retain some relevance to the present situation, whatever that may mean. The progressive aspect describes an event that takes place over a period of time. And the perfect progressive is some sort of combination of both. And then, magic, you can apply those concepts to unsuspecting verbs, to any verb in the lexicon. It's very economical. You won't even notice how terribly inadequate this solution is until you try to use it to teach the English tense aspect system to foreign learners of English. In fact, the one thing I recall from my English lessons at school is that this was a funny language with virtually no grammar, and the little grammar there was made very little sense to me. So there's this thing that if you say, I've lost my keys, the keys are still gone and you cannot get into your house. But if you say, I lost my keys, you've got a new set already? Really? That's hocus pocus, that's not grammar. A corpus-based approach to the same problem yields much more useful results. Corpus linguists may use the same categories of tense and aspect, but they keep them very close to the actual inputs. They keep a very close relation between the verbs and the actual tense aspect category, so to speak. So for example, Biber and his colleagues found that the verbs that are the most attracted to the present denote mental and logical states, such as I mean, I bet. And they could find these groups of verbs that particularly like a specific tense aspect combination for many of these categories, so to speak. So you have the perfect, it's I have given, he has left, they have sold. You have the progressive, I'm starving, it is bleeding. When you go to the simple past, you have things like he replied, she nodded, they remarked. But they also noted that relevant properties of the context sometimes pop out. For example, they remarked that, or they noted in the data that the past perfect is usually found with time adverbials, such as since then, so far, and recently. The issue is, I think many people in the audience will be able to relate to this, and this is a much more directly useful solution to learners, but it does look like madness, doesn't it? Within theoretical linguistics, researchers who have considered this so-called lexical option have always tried to reduce the lexicon to a limited number of categories. Wendler had 4, Maslow had 20, but if we follow this approach, we may have hundreds per cell. So what's going on when we learn the system? Do we simply memorize each individual item, or is there some system to this madness? To answer this question, we trained our computational model, which learns from the data the way humans do, to select a specific tense aspect form given the sentence context. Now let me tell you a bit more about the learning model first. The algorithm we're using is Rescorla and Wagner's model of classical conditioning. If you've heard of it, we'll probably associate it with work on animals and rats in particular, not humans. But Harald Beyer and Peter Mühlin implemented this rule computationally in 2011 as NDL, the naive discriminative learner, and started exploring its usefulness for morphological processing. And among the many models of learning they could have chosen, they chose this particular one. And the model stands out for a number of properties. For one, it's simple. It's also powerful. It explains a range of empirical learning phenomena. It's biologically plausible, and it has an evolutionary advantage over other more powerful learning mechanisms. They're more powerful, but they're also more greedy and more costly. Now, of course, these algorithms are phrased in mathematical terms. So if I put the formula on this slide here in words, then the Rescorla-Wagner rule is an error correction learning mechanism that defines how a system, it can be a computer, an animal, a human being, gradually learns to perform a task by associating cues and outcomes. And it learns not only from the positive supportive evidence it receives, but also, and in particular, from the prediction errors that it makes. Now, my 2 kids are Star Wars fans, and they are very proud of me for working on something that can be summarized with a quote from Yoda. The greatest teacher failure is. And that's actually what error-driven learning is all about. So let's see now whether the force can unravel the mystery of the English tense aspect system. To make the learning experience of our model as natural as possible, to the extent that that's possible, of course, we made sure that it could learn from realistic cues. So we offered it both individual words as well as chunks. So our cues are so-called n-grams. And we have 1 grams, 2 grams, 3 grams, and 4 grams. And these consist of 1, 2, and 3 or 4 words respectively. So an example of a 1 gram would be the, or past, or few, or years. 2 grams would give you things like the past, few years, few days. 3 grams become things like for the past, and 4 grams are combinations of 4 words. So the past few years, the past few months. And then, as I said, the model gradually learns to associate these cues with specific tense aspect combinations, which are our outcomes. So let's have a look at the sentence, since then he has managed to remain the spiritual leader of his people, which is an authentic sentence from the corpus. What would be the cues and what would be the outcomes? Now, the cues are the n-grams that we just talked about. And we also included what we call the lexeme, or the infinitive manage, in green on the right, because we thought it would be unfair on the model to have to predict what the speaker is going to say, rather than only predicting which form of the verb they're going to use. And the outcomes here at the top, those are the tense aspect labels. So the algorithm gets a lot of information. It gets the information about whichever words occur in the sentence, but it doesn't get the actual verb form has managed, and it doesn't get information about the tense aspect combination. That's exactly what it is trying to learn. So the algorithm then figures out which cues are good predictors for the outcome, given the way in which they co-occur, and it adjusts the strength or the weights of the relation between the cue and the outcome, given the errors it makes in the process of learning. We can see, for example, that the cue since then, here, dislikes the present or past simple. The connection line is cool blue, but it loves the present perfect, and the connection line is hot red. So once training on a large sample is complete, we can then go in and see whether the algorithm prefers the same tense aspect combination that the writer of the sentence originally used. In other words, we can see whether it would prefer the form has managed when it's showing the sentence at the bottom, excluding, of course, the words in red. And to say a little bit more about the training, the data we trained our model on is taken from the British National Corpus, which is a collection of 100 million words of mainly written and some spoken British English. The setup of the study is typical for any machine learning study. So we had 90% of the data for training and then 10% for validation and testing. And we had quite a large number of training events. So the algorithm was given over 6 million sentences to learn from. And it was then tested on about 175,000, so to speak. The cues, so our n-grams, our words, individual words, 2-word, 3-word, and 4-word sequences, there were in total 44,000 of them, and the model used that information to predict the outcomes. Now, I said there were 12 tense aspect combinations, but the future perfect progressive is so rare that we had to exclude it. I think there were about half a dozen examples in the entire British National Corpus, and that's not enough to learn from. So in the end, we were predicting 11 outcomes. And these are our results. Overall, the prediction accuracy of our model is 68%. And that means that in 68% of all cases, the algorithm's first choice was the tense aspect combination that was originally used in the sentence by the author. And that's an excellent result. I mean, we are looking at an 11-way choice. If you simply guess, you would get only 9% correct. And in this case, always choosing the most frequent tense aspect combination, which is in this case the present simple, would get you 46% correct. So 68% is a significant improvement. And that's if we only take the model's first choice into account. But that's not entirely fair on the model either. Because there's more, very often there's more than one option. And if we don't only take the first choice into account, but the first 3 choices, then the model gets 93% correct. And of course, you can take my word for the fact that taking the top 3 choices into account is a fair thing to do because often multiple options are possible, but let me convince you. Chris, can you start the first poll, please? So we're going to show you a sentence, and we're going to ask you to pick which verb form you think fits the sentence best. I can see who is voting, Chris, so I'm relying on you. Pleased to meet you, he. Which form of the verb reply do you think fits best? So basically 91% of all the respondents picked replied. And that is also what we got when we conducted the same experiment with a group of 60 native speakers of British English. So this is a clear case. There's only one real choice, and that's also what the model chose. But what do you do in case of the next sentence? Chris, you can start the next poll. If you, something on staying, I suggest you move your stuff to one of the other bedrooms. Which form of the verb plan fits best? And the results are in. So 45% chose plan, 40% chose are planning, and then we have were planning, have planned, and had planned. And that's pretty much the same as what we got from our 60 respondents. So you see that in this case, it would be unfair to just take the first prediction of the model because native speakers don't really agree what that one option would be. Their native speakers allow multiple options given the context. So we can say, if we take the top 3 predictions into account, our model gets 93% of all instances correct. But the bulk of the correct predictions are made for the present simple and the past simple. And they remain very low for the other tense aspect combinations, as you can see on the slide here. So present simple is blue, past simple is red, and all the rest is, virtually invisible. And you could conclude from this that learning follows by and large the natural frequency distribution that you can see in the pie chart in the upper right corner. Present and past simple, so the red and the blue slices of the pie, make up the bulk of the usage. And it's well known that many things in language have a Zipf-ian distribution, which means that a few things occur very often and most things occur relatively rarely. And you could say, well, things that occur more frequently are learned better. But this is not quite what we are seeing in our data. Actually, we found no correlation between the frequencies of the cue outcome co-occurrence and the association strength between the cues and the outcomes. In other words, it's not because things occur frequently together that they become strongly associated. The frequency of occurrence does something else. Let's take a look under the hood and inspect the cues that drive our findings. So when you look at this table and you're not a linguist at all, you can see that there is a clear split that goes there right down the middle. The two tenses on the left-hand side, the present simple and the past simple, they're strongly supported by the lexical items themselves. So there are verbs that are very strongly associated with the present simple, such as I thank you, I suppose, I hope, I remember. And then there are verbs that are strongly associated with the past simple, such as he replied, he whispered, he murmured, he nodded, he smiled. But other tense aspect combinations, such as the present perfect, but also the future simple, they're strongly driven by n-grams, by these contextual elements, such as we already, since then, if ever, or hopefully, it is hoped, you will be, etc. And this will remind you of what the Corpus linguists found, the table I showed at the beginning, that certain tense aspect combinations have very strong lexical cues, and other tense aspect combinations, they are triggered by contextual cues. But by doing this computationally, we can work on a much larger scale than Corpus linguists can, and we can gain further insights about language and about learning. So this chart here contains the distribution of each cue type, so contextual n-grams versus lexical cues, in the top 100 cues for each tense aspect combination. And you can see, just from the way it's colored, that relatively speaking, the present simple and past simple rely on lexical cues in bright pink, while the other tenses are supported by n-grams in any of the other colors. In other words, the frequency with which the tense aspect combination occurs decides what type of cue can come out tops. So frequency of occurrence and the Zipf-ian distribution of the tense aspect combinations in the input play a crucial role in the cue outcome dynamics. Because our lexical inventory is finite, we don't have unlimited verbs at our disposal. We have many, but there's an end to them. Verbs will have to be repeated once the tense aspect combination becomes frequent. So tense aspect combinations that occur less often than there are verbs available in the language are cued by n-grams. but tense aspect combinations that occur overwhelmingly more often than there are verbs in the input are cued by their own lexeme, so to speak. So frequently used tense aspect combinations, such as the present simple and the present and the past simple here at the top, they are instantiated by more than 3,000 different verb types, and those verb types are repeated many times, yielding 100 and something thousand instances of the present simple and of the past simple. But there's also a mid-layer of tense aspect combinations that have between 1,000 and 1,500 types that are each repeated 5 to 10 times only. And then there's a bottom layer of very rare tense aspect combinations where we are down to a few hundred types that each occur only once or twice. So the present simple and the past simple are very frequent for reasons I won't go into here. But what is important here is that because of the frequency with which these tense aspect combinations are used, lexical cues can come out strong. The number of times we use these tense aspect combinations far exceeds the number of lexical items we have at our disposal, so lexical items have to be repeated. In a sense, everything conspires for us to learn these simple tense aspect combinations really easily. They're frequently used and they have clear and simple lexical cues. Other tense aspect combinations are rare, which means that there are plenty of verbs to go around, so verbs are not repeated and do not come out as strong cues. Instead, contextual anagrams are the more stable element, but these are compound cues and those are harder to track and learn. So in a sense, everything conspires against learning these complex tense aspect combinations. They're rarely used and they have fuzzy, complex indicators. So to get back to our linguists and their two concepts of tense and aspect, someone who learns a system from use, for them, the system looks very different than a linguistic system of tense and aspect would lead you to believe. There are two systems, they're not tense and aspect, but there's a simple lexical system and a complex contextual system. And they are shaped by cognition and by usage in such a way that one is eminently learnable and the other one less so. So if Hamlet would have anything to say about the tense aspect system, I think he would say, though this be madness, yet there is method in it. So what transpires from this first case study here is that in order to draw an accurate picture of what is at stake in a linguistic phenomenon, it pays off to take a look at actual usage, ideally usage in context, as corpus linguists have been advocating for decades. When using the algorithm we use, it becomes possible to do this in a holistic and cognitively realistic fashion that's anchored in the principles of how we learn from input. And in addition to staying faithful to the raw input and to the cognitive commitment, the simplicity of the algorithm offers the added benefit that the workings of the algorithm are transparent and easily tractable. This makes it possible to understand how exactly certain connections come about. And I think these are points that will be well received by corpus linguists, who will also appreciate the fact that the output remains accessible for post hoc semantic analysis. So our work on tense and aspect in English has taught us things about language, but also about learning. What is the dynamics between the many cues that enter the learning process, and how does frequency of use affect this? In fact, as I said, we do use our work on language to understand learning better. What can be learned from exposure to usage, but also what input is needed to learn something. And that's something that's very confrontational for a linguist working with computational models. Computational models of learning, or computational models in general, force you to be very explicit about the input. They also do exactly what you tell them to do. They have zero imagination, which is sometimes good, sometimes frustrating. So far, as just shown you, we've used words as input, individual words, 2-word sequences, 3-word sequences, 4-word sequences. But that's actually not always enough. And I will tell you the story of articles, the most innocent little words in English. Articles such as and the are actually very rare across languages. The yellow triangles on the map indicate languages that have no trace of an article system at all. In fact, it's estimated that only 8% of languages have definite and indefinite articles. And these languages are mostly located in Western Europe. Now, in Western European languages, articles are the most frequently used words. They are obligatorily expressed whenever a noun is used. And if you're a native speaker of a Germanic or a Romance language, every fifth word you produce, hear, or read is an article. But I doubt you've ever given articles much thought. And I'm about to change that. Aaron, can we have the second poll, please? So if you see this sentence, which article would you say is missing? So you can choose from the, from an, or just leave it blank. Curious to see the results. 89% of you chose an, 7% chose the, and 4% chose nothing. I suspect there are some non-native speakers of English in the audience. When we did this with 16 native speakers of English, we got a unanimous choice. They all said the article that was missing was an. But things aren't always so straightforward. What article do you think is missing in this sentence? Again, you have the choice between the or nothing. I'm very curious to see these results. Okay, and there we get a much more evenly spread split. So there is no clear winner. 38% of people thinks nothing's fine, 36% of people thinks it should be the, and 26% of people thinks it should be a. And that's pretty much what we got when we polled 60 native speakers of British English. So in this case, all three options are possible. In fact, we tested 60 native speakers of English on a dozen of journalistic texts from which we had removed about 200 articles. And even though there's variation possible, we found that in more than 80% of all cases, the majority of our respondents picked the article that was originally chosen by the journalist. A very interesting finding was that those native speakers of English who also knew a foreign language were a lot more likely to be able to retrieve the originally used article than native speakers of English who didn't know a foreign language. So of course, we tried our trusted algorithm on the same task, and it was an epic fail. It did shockingly poorly. It only made predictions for 10% of all sentences, and in those cases, it retrieved the zero article correctly 12% of the time, but and the pretty much never. Our software, our programmer was close to crying. She still has nightmares about the articles modeling. But the linguists on the team and the linguists on the audience, I bet, are not so very surprised by this. But computer scientists might be, because deep learning models get excellent results. An associate team member, Dr. Harish Tayar-Madabushi, trained some deep learning models and found that they perform better than humans do when asked to retrieve the article originally used in text. But these models have been trained on over 3 billion words. They have pretty much unlimited memory and unlimited attention, and that's definitely not human. So how do humans choose which article to use? As I said, computational modeling forces you to be very explicit about the input, the information you learn from and base your decision on. And then the failure of our algorithm on this task showed us that article use is not learnable by forming associations between articles and other words in the sentence. But what information then is it learned from? Well, for humans, the words used in a sentence conjure up whole words. So in cognitive linguistics, these words are known as semantic frames, something Charles Fillmore did a lot of work on, incidentally, with Sue Atkins, the sister of John Sinclair. And on a cognitive linguistic approach, the meanings of words are an extension of our very rich bodily and cultural experiences. Take, for example, the notion of restaurant. You will all agree that the concept restaurant is associated with a series of other concepts like food, service, waiters, tables, eating. And these rich but contingent associations seem to be intimately related to our understanding of restaurant. And that knowledge plays an important role in how the grammar of the English article system works, but computers don't have access to it. The way in which this frame-related knowledge has been incorporated into philosophy and linguistics is by introducing, you will guess it, two new concepts: reference specificity and hearer knowledge. And as it says on the tin, they capture whether the hearer knows what you're referring to and whether you are referring to a specific thing. Now, both of these concepts have been very popular in research on language learning, and specificity in particular has played a major role. Both child first language learners and adult second language learners appear to find this concept of specificity very intuitive, to the extent that it has been claimed that specificity is an innate concept. But as Sinclair said, things look very different when you look at a lot of language at once, so let's do that. We annotated, in fact, we didn't, one of our postdocs did, Dr. Laurence Romain. She annotated a largish sample of 2,000 authentic sentences, again drawn from the British National Corpus. And one important point is that we used sentences in context, not in isolation. So we had 2 or 3 preceding sentences, the target sentence, and then another 2 or 3 following sentences. And we did this because we had established computationally that the information needed to make an article choice is not provided within the sentence. And the target sentence was annotated for 5 properties that had been suggested in the literature. So to begin with, hearer knowledge. When you read this sentence, I ran down the pavement to get as far away from the hotel as I could, then I sat down in a doorway and continued crying. Slowly the tears subsided, etc. So when you get to the tears, the hearer will not have been surprised to read about those tears because tears are implied in the statement of crying in the preceding sentence. When humans cry, there are tears. The tears are also specific. They're the subject's tears running down their cheeks. The noun tears has other useful properties as well. So it's a countable noun and it's used in the plural. We annotated for that information too. And we didn't see any further detail provided about those tears in the sentence or in the following sentence. So for this target sentence, the values of our 5 variables were set to the following. So the noun tears is known to the hearer. It has a specific referent, it's countable, it's plural, there is no further elaboration. And we did this for 2,000 sentences, which meant that we ended up with an awful lot of data. And when we have an awful lot of data, we of course go for the statistical tools. So we wanted to find out how well this additional information, not just the words in the sentence, but the information about whether it's known to the hearer, whether something specific, etc., how well that information would allow us to predict the choice of one of the 3 articles, the or 0. It's a difficult classification task, but fortunately there are excellent statistical classifiers available to help you get a grip on the situation. And we use the so-called tree and forest model, which finds a path through the data, and that path becomes your decision sequence. Now, I don't need to go into the details about the statistics because you all know decision trees from silly examples such as this one, which helps you decide whether you're entitled to eat chocolate. As a Belgian, of course, that's not a problem I ever face. It's always fine to eat chocolate. Here is a decision tree for the articles data, excluding set phrases. We won't go into that now. Surprisingly, This model is able to classify over 93% of all instances correctly, and that's really amazing. But in order to make article choice predictable, we needed to move away from specificity and promote hearer knowledge to the top position. And suddenly, for me, things started falling into place. At least that's what it felt like to me. I'm sure that my team thought I resembled a conspiracy theorist more than anything else. But when you think of it, so there is a reasonably easy way to select articles. The question you should be asking yourself is not, am I referring to something specific, but do I think the person I'm talking to knows what I'm referring to? If you think that the person you're talking to knows or should know what you're referring to, then the default article is the, here in green in the tree. You can use 0, that's the yellow one, but only if you're talking about something that's not specific and uncountable, as in, I had some chocolate, or plural, such as I had chocolates with my coffee. You don't need to know which ones. If they're Belgian, take them. If you do not think that the person you're talking to knows or could know what you're referring to, then your default is here in blue. Here too, 0 can be used, but pretty much only with plural nouns such as Belgian fries or uncountable nouns such as Belgian beer. And what emerges is that the key to the mystery of article use in English is the conversation partner. So the article system is a grammatical way for the speaker to keep tally of what they think the hearer should know, both in terms of familiarity and identifiability. So it's basically, articles are a system of knowledge calibration. In other words, articles aren't mere determiners, they form a reference tracking system. Now, of course, you will remark, but you use the statistical classifier for this, and you said before that these techniques may find patterns that language users won't detect. So we gave our algorithm a second chance, and lo and behold, the annotation worked wonders for our algorithm too. Suddenly it was able to master the English article system. And what you see on this slide is how our algorithm learned the grammatical category of English articles from exposure to naturalistic data, enriched with properties such as hearer knowledge, specificity of referent, number, countability, etc. In these plots, the variables are contrastively color-coded, with all values per variable encoded in different shades of the same color. For example, known to hearer is shown in light blue, while unknown to hearer is pictured in dark blue. And each of the panels represents an outcome. The 0 article is on the left panel, the article is on the middle panel, and the is on the right panel. And when you look at the cues, cues above the 0 line are positively associated with the outcome. So when they occur, the outcome in that panel occurs as well, while cues below the 0 line are negatively associated or dissociated from the outcome. And the learning simulation confirms that the relevant dimensions of experience intersect. Just by looking at the colors and comparing the colors across the 3 plots, you can tell that not all articles are learned from the same properties, and not all properties are equally important for all articles. You see that different colors come out tops. For the in the right plot, learning is dominated by hearer knowledge, and being known to the hearer is the strongest cue for the. This variable hearer knowledge is also important for the article a, but here being unknown to the hearer is the requirement. And for 0, the variables that are important are number and countability. Now, across the 3 panels, you can see very different types of cue dynamics, yielding for each article a different learnability profile. The on the right is characterized by 1 strong cue for and 1 strong cue against. It has a strong pale blue at the top and a strong dark blue one at the bottom. So it has clear indicators, but you also see that in the middle, there are a number of variables that are weakly associated with that outcome. The article in the middle plot relies on 3 cues, for and against, but the other properties are all around 0, so they play virtually no role. And 0 on the left is a bit of a mix of what we see for and the. So it has 2 strong cues for and against at the top and the bottom of the plot, and a bunch of things in the middle that are weakly helpful, and then a few variables that are irrelevant. Of course, we are now very keen to find a way to let our algorithm learn these distinctions directly from the raw data. We're not there yet, but the current results are already very useful. Recall that only 8% of languages have an article system. This means that the English article system poses enormous challenges for virtually all learners of English as a foreign language. It would be awesome if the insights we've gained can be used to support the development of knowledge in a foreign language, of knowledge in foreign language learners that resembles the knowledge native speakers have. So the question is, can we use our new knowledge to offer learners a shortcut to the relevant experience and get them off to a better start? Or if they're already stuck, can we use our computational model to design ways to get them unstuck? And we think we can. We hypothesize that articles are a nightmare for many foreign language learners because of a well-known effect in the animal learning literature called preexposure. Now, preexposure occurs when an experience is, so to say, incomplete. That means that one of the key ingredients, the context, the cue, or the outcome, initially occurs without the others. It's been attested in rats. And we think this may also be happening to second language learners who are native in some non-articled language. So languages that don't have a grammatical article system. For example, speakers of Slavic languages. Speakers of Slavic languages have years of experience referring to nouns without using articles. And of course they can tell whether their hearer knows what they're referring to and whether the referent of their story is uniquely identifiable or not. But they are used to tracking that information as a hearer, not as a speaker, and they're certainly not used to marking that knowledge formally. In other words, they know the context, they know the cues, but not the outcome, which is the article. And when they finally learn about articles in the foreign language classroom, they're very often given a list of articles with very specific rules, such as use the before nouns, meaning the only one, or before nouns, meaning the one we've just mentioned. Now, all of these things are known to reduce the cue outcome systematicity, and this affects learning and productivity. Not only in rats, also in human beings. So if we want language learners to achieve native-like competence, we should aim to evoke the same learning profiles we saw in native speakers, who will have learned how to use articles from exposure to usage. But how do we achieve that? Say, for example, we give the information that seems to do the trick for native speakers to a foreign language learner whose mother tongue does not mark articles, like a native speaker of Polish. Without going into much detail, you can see on this plot that the profiles for English articles that develop from learning in an error-driven manner are very different from what native speakers build up, meaning the knowledge foreign language learners build up about articles from the very same information is very different. So when you look at the left panel, you see that this poor learner doesn't understand what the zero article is doing in English at all. It's something they associate with Polish. You see the wiggly black line at the top. And speaking English, the wiggly gray line at the bottom, remains negatively associated with the zero article. When we look at the and the plots, we see that their best cue for using either or the is the fact that they're speaking English. The gray line is at the top. That's not very helpful. I know someone who can testify to that. The other cues do play some role. You see the other colors show up and they're not all zero. They're above zero, they're below zero, but a weaker one. And unfortunately, the lines become horizontal virtually immediately, so it doesn't look like associations will strengthen further with more practice. But as foreign language instructors, we're prepared for that. Confusion is something we expect, and we will combat it with clear instructions. So instead of giving our students the whole picture, we present to them a carefully curated selection of most important variables. But it appears that we only make it worse by focusing on a particular variable. And this is the profile that emerges when we tell the same Polish learner that specificity of referent is very important, which is exactly what most textbooks do. Now, when you compare the learning profiles with the ones the native speakers showed, it looks like we're even further from home. Now, both poles of the same variable become positively associated with an article. For example, both specificity and lack of specificity in green are positively associated with the, and both countable and uncountable in yellow and orange are counter-indicated. That's even less helpful. Over the next 2 years of our project, we aim to use this type of computer simulation to create individualized input for language learning. So working backwards from the errors a learner makes, we will provide examples of the right type in the right amount in the right order to get the desired outcome. This is rather different from the way in which foreign language learning has so far pursued improved outcomes. So they tend to focus on properties of the learner or the environment, making classrooms resemble real-life situations, making classes interactive and engaging, tailoring instruction to the cognitive abilities of the learners, but we instead will focus on the input as would be expected from usage-based linguists. In fact, we're currently recruiting pilot participants for a training study. So if articles really, really bother you, get in touch and we will try to fix you. So time to wrap up. And I hope that the case studies have convinced you that an interdisciplinary approach to language in use has a lot to offer in terms of linguistic description. But what does it have to offer the disciplines involved? Now, if we say it with pictures, linguists are in a sense interested in the end result of learning, and they like their knowledge neatly organized, as in this tool cabinet here on the right, which has a space for phonemes and morphemes and lexemes and constructions, and you name it, and it's there. And psychologists, they're interested in the process of learning, so how the rat learns to navigate the maze, and they like to be in control. In a different way than linguists, but still, I bet you that that maze is constructed according to very specific guidelines, and they have measured everything there is to measure about their rat. And we think we can fruitfully combine the myopias of psychology and linguistics because the process can help us understand the end result. If we let learning constrain the linguistic units and generalizations that our theory allows, we will have found a natural way to stay faithful to human cognition. But the end result also helps reverse engineer the learning process. Language is the most complex system humans learn to use, and its complexity challenges learning theory immensely. Working with a Q inventory of the size that is required for language learning will no doubt yield new insights into the mechanics of learning. So, to summarize this talk, after a visit from the rat, maybe our neat linguistic tool cabinet looks more like a messy tool drawer, meaning grammar may be more concrete than we think if we stay faithful to our lived experience and the linguistic input we receive. And to say it with Sinclair, grammar is nothing but a generalization over the usage patterns of individual words in utterances. So I'd say, let's not stray too far. And now it's time to thank the many colleagues who have worked with me over the past 2 decades. They're scattered all over the world, and they are too numerous to list individually, but I know who they are. And I would like to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for teaching me, for guiding me, for inspiring me, and for making the journey fun. Extra special thanks go to Peter Millen for turning what was a fun journey into a wild ride. And to my 3 guys for making it all possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dagmar, for a fantastic and absolutely amazing Sinclair lecture. We've really learned such a lot tonight. Normally, we'd now all go over to the arts building and have a celebratory drink, but obviously we can't do this year. So all that remains to say is really thank you all for joining us tonight, and stay safe, everyone.